Hello and welcome everyone to another exciting teen church, Fishhook Methodist situation. David here, giving my new work chair a test swivel. Hope you guys are all doing well. So today we're going to be looking at a very happy, exciting, uplifting topic in the form of rejection. Okay, so maybe not quite so happy and uplifting, but still a very interesting topic, of which the Bible speaks extensively about. So, we're following up from Stuart's topic last week, which was fear must fall. Speaking of Stuart, if you guys could keep him and the family in prayers as they recover from COVID, that would be awesome. Stu, we are definitely praying for you. And hopefully you guys are staying strong. So, you guys might have heard it said, hurt people hurt people. Okay, fun little truism. Hurt people, meaning that people who have been hurt tend to hurt others. But just a kind of a fun way of saying that. Hurt people hurt people. So we're going to kind of explore that idea a little bit in today's topic. We're going to be looking at the story of David and Goliath, but we're going to be sort of taking it from a different angle and looking at one of the most overlooked characters in that story, which is David's eldest brother, and his name is Eliab. Yeah, I think I'm getting that right. Eliab. So let's take a look at the story. Specifically, we're going to start from reading 1 Samuel 17, verse 28. And obviously, you guys know the story of David and Goliath. David's the hero. He kills Goliath. The Israelites are super stoked. But before that happens, there's a bit of an exchange between David and his brother. And that happens in 1 Samuel 17, verse 28. So let's take a look at that reading. Let me just quickly pull it up here so I can read it. Verse 28. So David's come down to kind of provide some support, bring supplies. His father Jesse said, hey, you need to go and help your brothers. So when he gets there, he hears the situation about Goliath and how Goliath's sort of taunting the Israelites. And he starts saying, geez, this guy's an uncircumcised Philistine. We should get rid of him. And his oldest brother says this to him. So he heard him speaking with the men. He burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those sheep? He was supposed to be watching the sheep in the wilderness. I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. So his brother's basically saying, man, what are you doing? You're supposed to be looking after the sheep. That's all you're good for. And he's pretty brutal. And obviously the dynamic between David and his brother is kind of complicated for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss. But David obviously still looks up to him. I mean, he is the oldest brother after all. So saying this would have probably hurt quite a lot. David would have been experiencing a fair bit of rejection in that little exchange, right? But the reason why Eliab said these words is because of the fact that if we go back a chapter in 1 Samuel 16, he kind of got burned pretty badly. And this is where David gets anointed to be the next king. Whereas Eliab, he actually gets overlooked, which is a huge bummer for him. So let's take a look. That's 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. So Samuel comes to anoint someone. He knows that it's one of the sons of Jesse. So he sees Eliab and he's like, hey, this guy's the perfect person. He assumed that he was going to be the king. He says, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. So he felt really burned because he was kind of overlooked by God. It doesn't mean that God didn't like Eliab. It just meant that he wasn't the right person to be king. And David was. So obviously, because of that fact and the fact that David, the youngest, the runt of the litter, essentially was the one that was anointed king, he felt kind of spurned, and that obviously hurt him. And he was acting out, maybe out of jealousy. He was probably pretty bitter that he had been overlooked. And there's that saying. It comes back to the saying that I said at the beginning: hurt people, right? So here Eliab is kind of sort of lashing out a little bit, and David's sort of getting the brunt of that. Now, one thing I find really fascinating is that David's response. So if we circle back to 1 Samuel 17, in verse 29, after hearing these pretty harsh words from his brother, you would have understood if David was like, oh man, he's right. Like, I'm not really worth much, and just sort of accepting his sort of rejected status. But instead, he just kind of brushes it off. He's like, whatever. This guy's, my brother's dealing with some stuff. I'm not going to take it to heart. In fact, in verse 29, he says, now what have I done? Can't I even speak? It's like, can I even say anything without my brother, like, jumping down my throat? And he kind of brushes it off like a joke, really. He's like, I'm not taking it too seriously. And he turns away and starts sort of speaking to some of the other guys that he was originally talking to. He doesn't take it to heart. And I think one of the reasons why David doesn't take this to heart, apart from maybe understanding his brother, is the fact that he knew God's calling on his life. Even though those words might have stung a little, especially because they came from his brother, he knew God's plan for him. In fact, if we head back all the way down to verse 37, we can see exactly David's mindset. He's focused on the task at hand, on dealing with Goliath. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Man, he wasn't even worried about that kind of rejection that his brother was trying to dish out. He didn't allow those words to get to him because he knew that God was in his corner, and what God said about him counted more. All right, so that's an important point that I'd like to make. So for us, you might encounter rejection on a personal level from a lot of different sources. For example, maybe it's from a close friend or a family member. Maybe it was like a romantic relationship. Maybe you had a breakup or something. There are a lot of ways to get rejected in today's age. But one that I wanted to point out is you can actually reject yourself. You can sort of think, man, I'm not good enough. And before, God has a chance to kind of affirm you, you can just be like, well, I'm not worth anything. And it's really important for all of us that whatever source of rejection we experience in life, that we understand how to place it correctly. Yes, it can hurt, but it's important to circle back to what God thinks about us and how he sees us. So for me, for example, just a little bit about that idea of self-rejection. When I was studying, and up until relatively recently, I was always striving really hard to be as good a musician as I could be. And I discovered along that journey that, especially when I got to university, that there were a lot of people a lot better than me. And I got to this point where I was like, man, I'm no good. Like, I'm not that good at playing the guitar. I don't think I really have what it takes. And I kind of settled into that state of self-rejection. I was like, oh man, what am I doing really? Why am I trying to do this? And it took me a long time to realize that rejection and that feeling that I wasn't good enough was actually really badly misplaced. And you can get that feeling of rejection from a number of different places that I mentioned before. But ultimately, what's important is that we do what I guess I eventually did, was to go back to the scriptures, to the Bible. What does the Bible say? What does God say about me? What is the way that he sees me? And I started meditating on some scriptures. One that I love in particular is the one that says that I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And scriptures that deal with, God has a plan for your life. Those are some scriptures that really resonated profoundly with me. And I started to meditate on those scriptures and realized that rejection that I'd been dishing out to myself, that was really, really misguided and was not an accurate representation of who I was. And this is basically the point that I'd like to make is that when you start listening to what God says about you, then the things that other people say, if they say mean things, or even if you don't see yourself in a particularly good light, it doesn't matter. Because God, the creator of the universe, sees you and he loves you. He cares about you. He made you and he loves you. And those truths really help to sort of place the words of other people and maybe even the words that you can sometimes, if you're feeling particularly negative, think about yourself. So I thought that was a really important thing when we're talking about this idea of rejection. The last thing I'd like to leave with you guys is that if we think about rejection from a biblical point of view, it would be a mistake not to mention how Jesus felt when he died on the cross. He, of course, bore the weight of the world, the sin of the world. And in his dying breath, his last words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? He experienced that profound rejection on the worst possible level, with a separation of him and the Father because of sin, because of the fact that he was bearing our sin. So he knows what it's like to experience rejection, both from sort of a personal point of view and generally. So I think it's really important that when we are in that space where we feel like maybe a little bit neglected, and that life, maybe someone in particular has just been a little bit unfair or mean, or maybe we don't see ourselves in the right way, that it's important that we know that Jesus understands what that is like, and he can lead us through that. So I want to encourage you guys just to keep that in mind. And if you do feel maybe a little bit like on the outs, or perhaps someone has said something that makes you sort of feel like you feel maybe rejected in some way, to know that God knows, and that he sees you and he sees that pain. And the good news is that he has some really encouraging things to say about us. And if we spend a little bit of time in his word, we will be able to see those things. So that's today's sort of lesson. There aren't too many questions, but maybe it's worth meditating on that story. And I encourage you guys to also head back to 1 Samuel verse 17 and see firsthand how David deals with those tough words from his brother, and see how he doesn't take it to heart, but he listens rather to the words of God. So guys, hope you're all having a wonderful Sunday, and I will see you all soon. Goodbye, everyone. Ciao.